Beneath the cold flicker of a broken street lamp in downtown Los Angeles, the city sleeps restlessly. Sirens distant, neon lights buzzing above crumbling sidewalks, while an old man, worn by time and solitude, makes his way home through a narrow alley. His steps are slow, cane tapping a rhythm only he understands, until shadows shift and violence erupts. Three figures, fast and faceless, strike without warning. A struggle, a cry, the glint of a blade. The man collapses, bleeding and alone, the city indifferent to his pain. Silence settles again, heavy and cruel, until from the far end of the alley a dog emerges, scruffy, scarred, and wild-eyed. The stray sniffs the blood, lowers his head, and nudges the man's lifeless hand. When there's no response, he circles, looks toward the street, then bolts. Through intersections and sidewalks, the dog runs, dodging honking cars, barking at strangers, chased away again and again, desperate to make someone understand. Most ignore him, some curse. But just as the sun begins to rise, a woman finally stops. She follows. And in that single moment, the story of a man the world forgot and a dog the world never saw begins. Under the glow of a streetlight that refuses to die. The night was thick with city grime and tension, the kind of suffocating silence that settles over downtown Los Angeles after midnight. Streetlights flickered with half-life, buzzing like dying insects above cracked sidewalks and forgotten alleys. Walter McCann, a wiry but weathered 72-year-old with silver hair tucked beneath a flat cap, locked up his tiny bookstore, the last of its kind on East 5th Street, and began his usual late-night walk home. His cane tapped a rhythm along the pavement as he hummed a Sinatra tune, unaware that tonight would change everything. He should have taken the longer way home, the one that looped around the Skid Row tents and graffiti-soaked buildings. But he was tired, his hip ached, and he'd walked this alley 1,000 times before. The shortcut was narrow and dimly lit, flanked by dumpsters and reeking of sour beer and decay. Halfway through, he heard it, the scrape of rubber soles behind him, fast and erratic. He turned just as a blur of movement rushed in. A fist crashed into his jaw, snapping his head to the side. He dropped his cane. Another blow to the stomach doubled him over, and before he could react, a third attacker kicked the back of his knees, dropping him hard onto the concrete. Three of them, young, twitchy, and violent. Teenagers, maybe 17 or 18, masked in hoodies and adrenaline. "Old bastard probably has a wallet," one snarled. "Let's just get it and bounce." Walter tried to speak, but a steel-toed boot slammed into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. He rolled onto his side, coughing, blood already wetting his lips. They rifled through his coat, found his wallet, his phone. "Cheap piece of crap," one muttered, chucking the phone into the wall where it shattered in a spray of glass. "Give us your watch," said the second, jabbing a finger in his face. Walter hesitated, his hands trembling as they reached for the faded wristwatch, a keepsake from his late wife. That's when the third teen, nervous, glancing around like a cornered animal, pulled out a pocket knife. "Hurry up, man. Cops roll through here sometimes." The blade glinted under the stuttering streetlight. "You don't move, I'll make you," the teen spat. Before Walter could hand it over, the knife plunged into his side. He gasped, his entire body locking in agony. They didn't even wait. One of them yelled, "Let's go!" and they bolted, laughter echoing off the walls as they vanished into the night. Walter slumped against the cold brick, clutching his side. Blood gushed through his fingers, hot and fast. He tried to crawl toward the alley entrance, but his limbs were slow, trembling from blood loss and shock. The distant city life carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed a block away, music thumped from a nearby nightclub, but no one looked into the shadows where he lay, bleeding and broken. Minutes passed like hours. Rats scurried nearby. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. The world blurred. He was slipping. But then, a sound. Low. Animal. Not the frantic scurrying of rodents or the lazy padding of a cat. This was deliberate, heavy, purposeful. Walter turned his head, barely able to lift it. From the far end of the alley, a figure emerged, silent, shaggy, and wild-eyed. A dog. Large, scrappy, with matted fur and a scar across its left brow. It crept closer, cautious but unafraid. Walter blinked hard, thinking he was hallucinating, but the creature didn't vanish. It sniffed the blood, then looked Walter square in the eyes with an intelligence that pierced the haze. And in that unspoken moment, beneath flickering lights, and the stench of Violentian unbreakable bond began to form. Shadow moved like a ghost through the alley, his paws silent against the cold, uneven pavement. He had smelled the blood long before he saw the man, metallic and sharp, laced with fear and pain. It wasn't the first time the stray mutt had witnessed the cruelty of humans, but something about this one was different. Maybe it was the way the old man's eyes fought to stay open, even as his life spilled out onto the concrete. Or maybe it was the faint scent of dried ink and old books clinging to his coat, the same kind that lingered in doorways where people once showed kindness. Shadow sniffed the wound, then growled at the direction the attackers had run, not loud but low and promising. He had survived this city longer than most because he knew when to fight and when to watch. Tonight, he chose both. Walter could barely keep his eyes open. Pain stabbed through his side in hot waves, his breath shallow, his limbs heavy. He felt the warmth of the dog's fur against his leg, and a cold, wet nose press against his hand. At first he thought it was a hallucination, some trick his dying brain conjured to bring him peace. But then the dog nudged him, hard. Walter groaned, trying to speak, but no words came. Shadow circled him once, ears twitching at every sound. The creak of a rusty fire escape, the distant whir of a passing patrol car, the soft moan of wind through the alley's metal vents. Then, without warning, the dog disappeared into the shadows. Minutes ticked by. Walter's vision dimmed. His heartbeat slowed. Then the dog returned. Shadow had scavenged a discarded fast food wrapper, greasy and still fragrant, and dropped it beside Walter's head as if offering him strength. Next, the dog tugged at an old quilted blanket half covered in trash a few yards away. His teeth locked into a corner of fabric, dragging it inch by inch, until it covered part of Walter's torso. With surprising gentleness, he laid beside the man, pressing his body close to Walter's to share warmth. It was instinct, not training, that told Shadow to keep the man from going cold. But instinct had kept him alive for years on these streets. Hours passed. At one point, a shadowy figure stumbled into the alley, a man high, twitchy, looking to pick the pockets of the dying. As he reached down toward Walter's coat, Shadow lunged. A savage snarl split the night as the dog bared his teeth, his body tense with warning. The junkie reeled back, cursed, and ran, too strung out to challenge the beast. Shadow stood over Walter, growling into the night long after the man had gone. He didn't know this human, but something in him wouldn't let go. Not tonight. Walter drifted in and out of consciousness, shivering beneath the blanket and the dog's warmth. At one point, he whispered something. Daisy, maybe his wife's name. But Shadow didn't understand. He only knew the man was still breathing. He needed to stay that way. And so Shadow kept watch. Through the darkest hours of the night, through sirens in the distance, through passing footsteps that never turned his way, his eyes never left Walter. Not once. The city didn't care, but Shadow did. And come dawn, something in the alley would shift. Because heroes don't always wear badges. Sometimes they wear fur. As the moon dipped low and the stars faded into the dull gray wash of early dawn, the city began to stir. But still, no one came. Walter's breathing was ragged now, shallow and uneven, as if each breath took more effort than the last. His body had gone cold, even under the makeshift blanket, and Shadow could sense the shift. The way the man's chest didn't rise as high, the faint tremble that once animated his fingers now still. A primal urgency ignited within the stray. He had seen death before. He knew the smell of it. He wouldn't let it take this man. Not yet. With a final nuzzle to Walter's cheek and a soft whine, Shadow stood and took off into the waking city. He darted past overflowing dumpsters, sprinted across streets buzzing with traffic, narrowly dodging cars and honking horns. He barked at joggers, chased delivery vans, even jumped onto the patio of a 24-hour diner, snarling and snapping to draw eyes. But each time someone tried to approach, he bolted just far enough to keep them following. Most swatted him away. Some threw coffee lids or cursed at him. To them, he was just another dirty stray. No one noticed the desperation in his eyes. No one followed. Still, he tried again, and again. An hour slipped by, then two. Walter faded faster now, lost in feverish dreams. In one, he was back in Saigon, calling out to fallen brothers. In another, he stood beside his wife Daisy, their daughter playing in the yard they lost years ago. But in the real world, he was slipping away. Meanwhile, Shadow's paws were raw from running. He barked at a mother walking her child to preschool, only for her to clutch her toddler and cross the street in fear. He weaved between cars in a traffic jam near a gas station and stood in front of a beat cop sipping a coffee. The officer shooed him away with a wave and a mutter. Damn mutts. Shadow didn't stop. He ran back to the alley, whined at Walter's side, nudged his hand, then tore back out again, more frantic than before. A construction worker noticed him this time, saw the dirt-caked fur, the blood smears around his mouth from licking the wound. The crazed look in his eye sand grabbed a rock. Get out of here, he shouted. The rock missed, but the message hit hard. Shadow didn't understand cruelty, not like humans gave it, but he understood being ignored, and it cut deeper than any stone. It was almost 7 a.m. when Shadow, heart pounding and lungs heaving, crossed paths with someone different. Claire Ramirez, an ICU nurse just ending a double shift at St. Luke's, was known for her intuition. She always said animals could feel pain the way empaths feel emotion. As she exited the underground garage, Shadow charged at her car, barking wildly, planting his paws on the driver's side door. She slammed the brakes. Most people would have kept driving, but Claire saw something else in the dog's wide, panic-filled eyes. A message. She cracked the window. What's wrong, boy? Shadow circled the car, barked again, then darted toward the alley, and paused, looking back. She hesitated, but instinct pulled at her hard. Against every rational thought, she parked on the curb, grabbed her stethoscope from the dash, and followed. Shadow sprinted ahead, then stopped, then ran again. It took only minutes, but to Shadow, it felt like eternity. When Claire rounded the corner into the alley, the sight stopped her cold. Walter lay crumpled beneath a ragged blanket, pale as death, lips blue, blood soaked into his side. She rushed forward, dropped to her knees, checked his pulse, and felt the faint flutter of life still holding on. Jesus Christ, she whispered, then louder. Someone call 911. The alley filled with noise and chaos in seconds. Paramedics bursting in with equipment, an LAPD cruiser screeching to a halt nearby, and Claire barking rapid-fire vitals at the EMTs. Shadow stood nearby, panting, shaking, unsure if he should stay or flee. But Walter's head turned weakly at the commotion, eyes barely open, and found the dog. A smile ghosted across his lips. He tried to lift a hand. Good boy, he rasped, so faint only Shadow could hear it. The dog stepped forward, tail wagging just once. Then the medics were loading Walter onto a stretcher, cutting open his shirt, applying pressure to the wound as a monitor beeped into life. Claire rode in the ambulance, and before they shut the doors, she looked back. Someone take care of that dog, she shouted to the nearest cop. But Shadow didn't move. He ran alongside the ambulance, tongue hanging out, muscles burning, refusing to be left behind. The cruiser behind him flicked its lights on and cut him off gently. Officer Jenkins, a grizzled man with a soft spot for strays, got out slowly. Whoa there, buddy! You part of this? Shadow barked once, then sat. Jenkins looked at the blood on his fur. Well, hell. I guess you are. Walter's condition was critical. The knife had sliced deep, narrowly missing a major artery, and blood loss had pushed his body to the brink. But the doctors, led by Claire's rapid intervention, worked fast. By mid-morning, Walter was stabilized, breathing with assistance, clinging to life. In the waiting room outside the ER, Shadow lay curled on a donated towel, a bowl of water nearby. Jenkins stayed with him, sipping bad coffee, watching the dog with a strange respect. You really saved that man, he muttered. Don't think I've ever seen anything like it. As the hours dragged, news began to spread. A nurse posted about the stray who saved a life. A local news van pulled up. A reporter filmed Shadow lying patiently, refusing to leave the hospital doors. People online started calling him the streetlight guardian. Meanwhile, Walter, unconscious and unaware, dreamed again. This time not of war or regret, but of a dog with fire in his eyes and loyalty in his soul. In his mind, he reached out. And somewhere in that sterile hallway, Shadow lifted his head and stared at the doors as if he'd felt it too. Walter drifted between dreams and darkness for nearly 2 days, tethered to machines and drifting through memories. Gunfire in the jungle, laughter in his old bookstore, the feel of Daisy's hand in his. When he finally opened his eyes, the hospital lights blinded him, and the pain in his side throbbed with every breath. Claire was there, holding a chart. "Welcome back, soldier," she said softly, and something in her voice told him the worst had passed. But he didn't ask about his condition first. He whispered hoarsely, "The dog. Where's the dog?" Claire smiled. "Still outside, hasn't left. We gave him food. He wouldn't come in without you." Tears welled in Walter's eyes, something he hadn't allowed since Daisy's funeral. But in that moment, everything he thought he'd lost came flooding back. A reason to fight, to live, to matter again. "Bring him to me," he rasped. And when Shadow was finally let in, tail thumping low and hesitant, Walter reached out his trembling hand, and the dog curled into his side like he belonged there. 2 broken things, finally whole again. As Walter's recovery began, the hospital buzzed with media interest. The story of the heroic stray had gone viral. News crews camped outside. Donations flooded in to help Walter and Shadow. But with attention came danger. The teens who stabbed Walter, members of a local street crew called Neon Blades, saw the story too. One of them, Marcus, panicked. "If he wakes up, we're screwed," he said to the others. He saw our faces. Tensions rose. They debated skipping town, but the gang leader had another idea: make sure Walter didn't testify. That night, a man dressed in hospital scrubs slipped through the emergency room side door. He walked with confidence, clipboard in hand, face masked. But Shadow, sleeping beside Walter's bed, awoke instantly. He caught the scent, the sharp odor of sweat, weed, fear. The figure drew closer, pulling a syringe from his pocket. That's when Shadow lunged. Chaos erupted. The intruder screamed as the dog sank teeth into his arm. Alarms blared. Security burst in just in time to see Shadow pinning the man to the floor, snarling with blood dripping from his muzzle. The syringe skittered under the bed. The man was arrested. Walter, wide-eyed, looked at Shadow. "You saved me. Again." With the attempted hit foiled, the police dug deeper into the attack. Officer Jenkins interviewed Walter in his hospital room, slowly building a case against the teens. But something in Walter's demeanor had changed. The old soldier's fire had returned. "I want to help," he said. "I remember their faces, the blade, their voices." He even recalled the scar above one teen's left brow. Jenkins nodded grimly. But another revelation shocked even the seasoned cop. Walter wanted to press charges and testify in court. "Let them see me walk in there alive," he said. Meanwhile, Claire did some digging of her own and found something haunting in Walter's file. His daughter, whom he hadn't spoken to in years, had been trying to contact him. "She's living in Riverside," Claire said. "Name's Rachel McCann. She called the hospital when she saw the news." Walter's eyes filled with shame. "She hasn't spoken to me since the war. I pushed her away. She buried her mother alone." Claire gently placed a hand on his arm. "Maybe it's time to stop surviving and start healing." And when Rachel came to the hospital the next day, with tears in her eyes and her young son clinging to her side, Walter whispered, "I'm sorry." And Shadow sat beside him, tail wagging as if blessing the reunion. The trial moved fast. With a media spotlight and Shadow's heroism gaining traction, the DA pushed to bring charges quickly. Walter arrived at the courthouse in a wheelchair, his ribs still mending, Shadow at his side with a bright orange vest labeled Certified Companion Witness. The courtroom buzzed with attention as Walter took the stand. He described the attack in clear, painful detail, The shouts, the blade, the laughing as they left him to die. Then, as cameras clicked outside the windows, he pointed to the accused teens and said, "They tried to take my life, but they didn't count on a dog with more loyalty than any human I've ever known." The courtroom hushed. One of the teens, Marcus, broke down, sobbing into his hands. Shadow's eyes never left him. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, Walter didn't cheer. He only nodded. Justice had been served. But as he left the courtroom, reporters rushed him. One asked, "What do you say to the people calling you a hero?" Walter turned, looked at Shadow, then said, "I didn't save myself. He did." A week after the trial, Walter sat in his hospital bed, feeling stronger by the day. Rachel and her son visited often now, and Shadow had become a beloved figure in the children's ward, visiting sick kids and giving hope where medicine could not. But then, an envelope arrived. Hand-delivered, no return address. Walter opened it cautiously. Inside was a note scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You think this ends here, old man? You've made enemies. That dog can't protect you forever." Enclosed was a Polaroid, Shadow lying outside the hospital, circled in red ink. Jenkins was called immediately. Security was tightened, but Walter wasn't afraid. Instead, he stood on his own 2 feet for the first time in days. "If they want to come, let them," he growled. "But they'll learn what that dog already knows. I don't back down." Just then, Claire walked in, holding a letter of her own. "This came from the mayor's office," she said. Walter opened it. A formal request. Would Walter and Shadow accept a city honor for bravery and public service? Walter smiled through the pain. "We'll go," he said, "but only if they make the medal big enough for both of us." The city event was set in Pershing Square, a ceremony to honor everyday heroes. Walter wore his best-pressed blazer and stood tall beside Shadow, who sported a new vest embroidered with "Streetlight Guardian." Reporters, veterans, families, and schoolchildren filled the park. Rachel and her son sat in the front row, beaming with pride. The mayor took the stage, preparing to present the medal. But just as the speech began, Shadow stiffened. His ears perked, head turned, and a deep growl rumbled in his throat. Walter noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, his instincts flaring. Across the square, a man in a black hoodie was weaving through the crowd, a hand tucked into his jacket. Jenkins, working crowd security, spotted him too, but too late. The man shoved past a family, pulled a small revolver from his coat, and aimed straight at the stage. It was one of the Neon Blades, a cousin of one of the convicted teens, seeking revenge. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the air. Walter instinctively stepped in front of Rachel and his grandson. Then Shadow launched forward like a bullet. The shot rang out. Shadow collided with the man mid-lunge, teeth clamping onto his gun arm, knocking him off balance. The bullet went wild, ricocheting off a steel pole. Jenkins tackled the assailant seconds later, but not before the man kicked Shadow hard in the ribs and threw him into a metal barricade. The dog whimpered and crumpled. Shadow was rushed to an emergency vet clinic nearby, his breathing shallow, a cracked rib pressing into his lung. Walter rode in the back of the squad car behind the ambulance, fists clenched, eyes red but dry. The city had watched in real time. Cameras caught it all. Shadow leaping through the air to stop a killer. Social media exploded with outpourings of rage, hope, and prayer. Crowds began gathering outside the animal hospital. People brought candles, flowers, toys, and handwritten notes. "He saved us again," Claire whispered, sitting beside Walter in the waiting room. Jenkins joined them, shaken. "City wants to give you the medal privately now," he said. Walter shook his head. It's not about medals. I want him back." Hours passed. A surgeon entered, removed her mask. "He's alive," she said. It was close, but he fought. Walter exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. When he was finally allowed to see Shadow, the dog lay sedated but peaceful, bandaged and breathing steadily. Walter knelt beside him, resting his hand gently on Shadow's head. "You never gave up on me," he whispered, "and I swear to you, I'll never leave you behind again." Weeks passed. Walter walked now with less of a limp. He and Shadow moved in with Rachel and her son, finally becoming the family neither thought they'd have again. The bookstore reopened. Donations poured in from around the world. Walter renamed it Streetlight Books, its new logo etched with the silhouette of a dog under a lamppost. Shadow recovered. His body slower now, but his spirit never dulled. The city held the rescheduled ceremony months later, this time with full honors. Shadow wore a custom medal around his neck as he walked beside Walter, the crowd standing and applauding like royalty had arrived. The mayor knelt and whispered, "You gave this city its heart back." Walter, holding Shadow's leash, smiled. He just reminded us what it meant to care. As the sun dipped low, a streetlight flickered to life behind them, one of the very ones Walter had nearly died under, but it didn't flicker like it used to. It burned steady now, strong, unbreakable, just like the bond between an old man and the dog who never stopped guarding him. The city may forget headlines, but it never forgets its guardian. And under that eternal streetlight, their story lives on.